the Forest Hill Center. Last call. And so we've started on Monday nights and Thursday evenings a learning program with people who are not from, but they're eager to learn. And we have a lot of people who are junior chavrusas who are now looking for senior chavrusas. If you think you might have a chance, an opportunity, if you think you have the time and the cheshek to be able to be mashpia someone and mamish to change someone's life, please speak with me, because we can really use people who are able to sit and learn with people who have the cheshek and who want to learn, but need to be guided and kind of led a little bit. So it'd be a huge mitzvah, and we're looking for some senior charusas, so please speak with me.
Sponsors, where Rabbi Lowy introduces Rabbi Tatz. As you know, this is part of our Tzeh Ulmad series. We're always looking for additional sponsors. I wanted to thank the sponsors for tonight. Tzvi Hirschman provided the kugel, the jolt, and the tishka in honor of the wedding of his son, upcoming wedding of Eli and Abigail, Eli Hirschman and Abigail Friedman. Also by Jackie Gans, Lee Mishpa's mother. If you missed the breakfast, make sure you don't miss it next year. And also by Yad Vashem Monuments. You don't know, they're the ones who always highlight genes of the previous generations and everything that they accomplished. Everybody.
It's a big cover for us to have Rabbi Akiva Tatz to address us. Someone I remember, beginning years ago, I saw his books. Every one of his firm, a really ma'ira person, a show a person what Rabban Shem is all about. In this week's parsha, we have that first. Abraham Avinu was Mashbiya, Eliezer Elokei Shamayim, Elokei Aretz. And later he only said Elokei Shamayim. So Rashi brings the Chazal, the Medrash, that Hergalti Oisib B'nei Oilam. I brought the bunch from down from heaven to this world. Before he was only Elokei Shamayim, people didn't recognize and realize. I mean, every one of his swarm, I mean, he's a prolific writer, but the way he brings down the sciences of the world and the shkafa of the world, Elokei Hashemayim, Elokei Aretz, brought him down to Elokei Aretz. And the topic is so apropos for this week's parsha, the parsha of Zevugim, when Abraham Avinu told Eliezer to find a wife for Yitzchak, said should go to Eretz Moladati. Some Mepharshim say, why do you only want from there? Because he wanted the genes from that place, the genes from his family, even though they also avoid the Zara. But the midos, the main thing is to have the midos, to have the proper midos, and the proper midos, you see it by Rivka, you see it, and that is only on the Shpachta. You should go to our family, to the Jewish genes, the genes of Avraham Avinu, the genes of that Mishpacha that's full of chesed. So we have the schutz that Tatz is going to explain to us and bring out what the whole lineage of the genes are, the whole lineage of marriage, and we'll be zeicha to be mushpa from him. And I just know one story I heard this week. There's a Bacher went off the derech, and the only thing that made him come back to the derech, he heard the drasha from Rav Tatz, and there's hundreds of people like it all over the world. He made the Rabban Shem Elokei Hashemayim, Elokei Aretz. Rabban Shem helped that he should be zeicha, where all his drushes that he gives in the world, the swarm that he writes in the world, to bring down the Rabbeinu Shalom, to be Makar people, and it's a schus for us that he's going to address us tonight.
Yeshua, thank you very much for this opportunity to, for the permission of the Rav, to learn a little bit about genetics and halacha. Can you hear me at the back? Marish, can you hear me? If you don't hear me, come and sit up front, okay? I've been talking all day, so let us take a look at the issue of genetics, and with your permission, I'd like to discuss it broadly what is the situation of modern genetics or genomics today? Where does it intersect halacha? And I hope you'll find this fascinating and practical as well. Anything that here is relevant to Psak halacha, you ask the Rav. My job is just to show you the fascination of this area and perhaps stimulate some thought. So before we get to marriage, let's just think about where modern genetics is at and some of the halakhic applications of the field. First of all, I'm sure you know that the cutting edge of medicine today is genetics. When I was a medical student many years ago, genetics was coming to the fore, and today it's at the forefront of all of medicine. Hardly a day goes by when a new disease is not described in terms of the genetic cause. And as you probably know, we are now able to modify the genome. At least 2 diseases now being treated by actually injecting genetic reprogramming agents into the body that can actually modify your genes. Who's a genetic counselor? Somebody is a counselor, right? We've got one professional here, so no doubt she'll correct me if I say something wrong. So today we are actually able to edit the genome. That's a shaila in its own rights. Can you modify people's genes? So let's take a look at some of the cutting edge issues in modern genetics. The first question, which is quite well known, is can you identify people from their DNA? This has tremendous application with finding dead bodies or parts of bodies, to move somebody, kivrei avos. In other words, can you move? As the Rav will tell you, we don't move bones or bodies almost for any reason. One of the reasons is maybe when a person needs to be buried together with family members, sometimes to move there to Israel, even that should only be done under very specific circumstances. And we can identify bodies and bones and body parts from genes. The DNA is an extremely stable molecule. You can take 5,000-year-old bodies and identify the DNA. It doesn't degrade. And so we can use that for identification of people. Where are we holding today with using DNA? So the modern poskim, Rav Asher Weiss, for example, who has a number of chuvas on this, and I've spoken to him about some of these issues. The status today is using DNA to identify people has a place in halacha. And I think the way to approach it is this. You know, when it comes to identifying, let's say, a body. So the classic question is whether a woman may remarry when her husband has disappeared. Witnesses aid him see the body. We need them to testify that it is the person in question. They need to see the face, the central part of the face. They need to see the nose. That is proof that the person has died. However, what happens if they can't see the face? Oh, here's an interesting story. Diane Lichtenstein from London, a few years ago, found himself in the shower 20 minutes before Shabbos when his wife says, you have to take this call. Diane comes out of the shower, finds himself speaking to the Nigerian ambassador, British ambassador from Nigeria. Rabbi, I'm sorry to have to tell you, there was a Jewish businessman from London who came to Nigeria. Unfortunately, he went swimming in the ocean and he drowned. We've recovered his body, and I have to send him back to Britain for burial. But Nigerian law does not allow me to send a body without embalming the body. I don't want to break or offend your religion. What am I allowed to do to this Jew's body before I'm allowed to? So the Rav discussed with him, decided exactly what would be mutter, and he advised him. And then the rabbi said to the ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, I want you to go back to the mortuary, look at the dead man's face. I then want you to take a photograph of his face. I want you to have the photograph printed out. I want an ambassadorial stamp on the photograph with your signature stitched to the dead man's chest. The Rav was concerned that by the time the body arrived back in England, they may not be recognizable. Now, this is not to aid him, but he felt evidently this would help in the identification of the person. And that's what happened. This Jewish mate arrived back in England with a photograph stitched to his chest, signed with a Nigerian ambassador stamp on the, okay. So if you can't identify the face, what can you use? So Gemara discusses simonim. And the question is, what is a simon? So you know, probably in halacha we have siman mufak, that is a simon that is extremely unique. Then we have a siman beinani, something that is an identifying feature which is maybe not that unique. And then you have run-of-the-mill simonim, which are not that unique in identifying people. And you probably know when it comes to returning a lost object, for example, I find an object, you say it's yours, I don't show you, you describe it to me, you tell me the simonim. If they're good enough, I return the object to you. And similarly, if we find a body that we don't see the face, but we have unique enough features that identify the body, that might be good enough. Any dentists here? Dentists? So you know that the gold standard in forensic medicine today is dental records. Because if you have a good dentist and they keep records, and particularly when a lot of dental work has been done, you can see using the x-rays a unique dental pattern, and the teeth survive acid attacks and fires. So those have been used as simonim. What would be a good simon in halacha? So here you have, maybe let's say you find a body part that has a unique birthmark, maybe a unique tattoo, even though Jews shouldn't be tattooed. But the point is that a tattoo cannot be erased, and so it's always there. I'll never forget the experience when I was a young doctor. I had a young fellow came into my surgery, jumped up on the examination couch to be examined, took off his shirt, and he had tattoo on his arm: Meg, crossed out; Beth, crossed out; Margaret, crossed out; Becky. I think Becky featured twice. You'd think you'd get the message. You can't erase it. You had to keep adding. So let's say you found that might be, perhaps that might be unique enough. Now, what is the status of DNA? So the poskim over the last 500 years or so, the Gemara doesn't discuss statistics in the way that we use statistics. In fact, we're quite skeptical about statistics. We have a rave and a miut, but specific statistical probabilities we don't discuss. And yet, for the last few hundred years, you find in poskim a discussion, and Rabbi Yashiv also used to talk in this way with certain medical questions. 1 in 1,000 would be considered probably a simon mubak. 1 in 1,000. Right? That is unique enough that we could possibly talk about using this as an identifying feature. Now, DNA is 1 in 10 million. Okay, you characterize someone by a little DNA sample, you're talking about something way better than 1 in 1,000. But it's newfangled, there's room for lab error. How do we see DNA in halacha? So this has exercised the minds of our posking over the last few decades, I would say. And I would think the state of the art, and again, the Rav is the one to ask here. But poskim have said, for example, Rav Asher Weiss writes about this, that if we would have raglaim ledavar, which means background corroborating evidence, plus DNA, we could use that in many halachic circumstances. The classic and most famous case is when the buildings were attacked in 9/11. You probably know almost no bodies were found, but there was one part of a body that was found that was thought to belong to a Jewish businessman from New York, but all they found was a body part. They checked it for DNA, and it perfectly matched hair in his hairbrush at home in his apartment in New York. In addition, he was talking to his wife on the phone when the buildings were attacked. Something's happening, we don't know what it is, and he was never heard from again. She was allowed to remarry. Why? Because raglaim ledavar, we know it's in the building, plus the DNA match, that might be good enough in halacha. Another example in the Minchas Osher, he writes about a young man who is a man who wanted to marry a woman whom a Kohen may not marry. The problem is that his father's a Kohen, but it's not so clear that he's a Kohen. There was a confused adoption story in the family, and they wanted to know if they could use DNA evidence to identify whether he is in fact the son. Rav Asher allowed them to take DNA, conclusively proved that he is not the son of that father, and on that basis, raglaim ledavar, there was already a problematic paternity question in the family, plus the DNA. So in many ways, the DNA now is being used by the way, we often have in genetic labs today, and I've been involved with a few cases like this, we often have terrible issues. For example, you send a family for genetic testing, and it becomes apparent to the lab that the husband's not the father. You have cases like that? In other words, this woman has had a relationship with another man. No one knows except her. And it becomes painfully obvious to the genetics lab that this husband's not the father. The question is, do you disclose that to the family? The consensus throughout the world today is you don't disclose because they didn't come for that. They came for medical information. The problem is when the genetic counselor over there sits with the family, although she doesn't tell them that this man's not the father, as soon as the genetic counselor starts explaining the genetics of the disease, it becomes obvious to anybody with any sense that this man could not be the father. Okay, and that can, of course, wreak havoc in families. And these are the kinds of things that we're dealing today with modern genetics. So the first question is, can you identify people by means of their DNA? And these are some of the thoughts of poskim today. Now, more recently, moving a little bit ahead in time, I don't know if you know this, but a Jewish gene has been discovered. An Ashkenazi gene. Today, work is being done with Bukharian Jews and others, but to date, we have a gene that is uniquely characterizing Ashkenazi Jews. If you'd like to look up the research on this, I recommend 2 books. One is called Legacy by Professor Harry Ostro, who's a geneticist at YU, who's written an excellent academic book on population genetics, in which he shows fascinating features of the Jewish community. By the way, before I tell you about the Ashkenazi gene, any Kohanim here? Any Kohanim? So listen to this story. About 20 years ago, Dr. Karl Skarecki, who happens to be from Toronto, was sitting in shul, and he happens to be a Kohen, and he happens to be a geneticist. He's sitting in shul one Shabbos morning when he sees they're calling up a man for Kohen who's a Yemenite. Now, the Yemenite looks like a Yemenite. Dr. Skarecki doesn't look like a Yemenite. I think Skarecki is now the dean of the school in Beersheba. No? Dr. Skarecki is sitting there watching this Kohen, and he suddenly thinks to himself, if he's a Kohen and I'm a Kohen, that means we descended from the same man. That's what it means to be a Kohen. We're both children in direct line, paternal line from Aaron Kohen. And nowadays we can prove it. How do we prove it? Well, if you know genetics, you know that we can check as long as we can find a paternal line. In other words, your DNA is a mix and match of your parents. If you want a paternal line, which you need for being a Kohen, we need to find DNA that you get only from your father. Which genes do you get only from your father? The Y chromosome, right? So if we could find a unique pattern on the Y chromosome, we'd know that that is an unbroken paternal line. Skarecki thought to himself, well, we can prove it. What did he do? Where do you find hundreds of Kohanim at one time and place? At the Kosel. So Skarecki went to the Kosel on Chol HaMoed. There's a couple of thousand Kohanim. He set up his little table with his genetic stuff, and he invited Kohanim. All he required was you say you're a Kohen, no other corroboration. Took a little bit of skin from the inside of their cheek and and he found a unique pattern among Kohanim. It's called the CMH, Cohen model haplotype. It's a 6-featured unique genetic pattern, which is unique to Kohanim with a very high order of what do you call it? Association. He then decided he gave the work to a team at Oxford University, non-Jewish researchers, and they investigated Kohanim from around the world, and they found a clear lineage indicating that people today claiming to be Kohanim are descended from one man. They say he lived about 2,000 years ago. Now, we wouldn't agree with the 2,000, we'd say more like 3,000, but it's not bad, okay, not bad. And of course, the genetic, it's called the molecular clock. We can check how many generations have gone by from a common ancestor to today. How many years have gone by, we have to make assumptions because we don't know how old people were when they're having their children. The Gemara says there were time when people who were 8 years old having children. So we need to make assumptions about the years. Is this clear what I'm saying? So we can't always tell how many years have gone by, but we can tell with precision how many generations have gone by from a common ancestor to descendants today. So read the research yourself, you'll find it's fascinating. One particularly moving feature, when you look at this non-Jewish academic research, they come to the conclusion, this proves conclusively that a high percentage of men in the Jewish religion today claiming to be Kohanim share a common ancestor. But there's one paragraph in there that is very moving. They write there, these non-Jews, an unexpected finding, unanticipated finding in this study was an unprecedented level of marital fidelity among the Jewish people. Do you know what this means? You have here a father to son lineage. If one woman in 3,000 years conceives a child from a man other than a husband, you've broken the chain forever. The discrepancy was 2%. You're talking about 3,000 years of Jewish pillaging and rapes and pogroms. Okay, and through all of that, there's an unbroken line of women's loyalties to their husband throughout Jewish history, right? At least Kohanim. Don't ask me about the rest, but at least Kohanim. And these non-Jewish researchers said they have never found a community with this level, okay, of marital loyalty throughout the generations. Anyway, this has had some amazing consequences. One is, I am South African. In South Africa, there's a black tribe called the Lemba people. They are black people. They don't look, they're black. They're black Negroid people. They claim to be Jews. They say they're descended from Yemenite traders who traded through Africa over a number of centuries, must have married converted women in Africa. And they claim I was raised in South Africa. We thought that was a joke. These people aren't Jewish. Not only that, they have a clan among them called the Buba clan, and they claim to be Kohanim. We thought that was even funnier. Well, Skarecki tested them and they have the Kohen gene. There's going to be some interesting surprises when the Mashiach arrives. Of course, it doesn't mean you're Jewish necessarily. There are Portuguese and Spanish Catholic men today who have the gene, no doubt. During the Spanish expulsion, probably, all it means is a paternal line. Doesn't mean you're Jewish. Anyway, that is some of the fascinating research that has been done on Kohanim. Now, and while I'm on the subject, I can't resist telling you something even more amazing. Also, about 15, 20 years ago, when this work started to be done, two American academic teams decided to research how closely related are all humans on Earth. How many ancestors do we all have? They decided to look at a maternal lineage. Now, you know, you have a Y chromosome from your father. You don't have a chromosome from your mother, uniquely. But what you do have is in the mitochondria. I won't embarrass you by expecting you to remember your high school biology perfectly, but you probably know that in the human cell, there's a nucleus, which is about 25,000 genes, which is about the same number as a fly, but be that as it may, they're 25. And then outside the nucleus, you have mitochondria, small microcosmic, microcellular organelles that provide energy for the cell. For unknown reasons, there are a few genes in the mitochondria, 20 to 30 genes, which you get only from your mother, which means you can check an unbroken maternal lineage if you look at the mitochondrial DNA. Is this clear? Howard? Clear? So what they did was they decided to do a study of all humans on Earth. So they took a little bit of placenta from babies being born throughout the known world, South America, Papua New Guinea, South Africa, and listen to what they found. It turns out that all humans on Earth today are descended from one woman. They call her mitochondrial Eve. They say she lived about 120,000 years ago. Now, we would dispute the age, but it's not bad compared to the 3 billion they were talking about before. What's interesting is that both these studies have a second last paragraph, which says, this proves conclusively that all humans on Earth today are descended from one woman. And then there's an added paragraph. Of course, we know this is ridiculous and impossible. There must have been many pre-hominid ape-like creatures. But what must have happened is, for some unknown reason, the progeny, descendants of all the rest of the apes must have died out, except for one fortunate female, who's the mother of us all. All right, we say right observation, wrong interpretation. But anyway, that is the so-called Eve hypothesis and genetic research that has been done on that line. Now, more recently, coming up to the more present, is an Ashkenazi gene that has been discovered. Again, a unique gene tracing itself back to the Middle East and then to Rome, and is a common feature among Ashkenazim today. What are the consequences? So I'll give you a few. Again, we're not using this to diagnose you as Jewish yet, although one of the Dayanim of the London Basin 2 weeks ago asked me a discussion. They have a person from the former Soviet Union with inaccurate records, but very suggestive that this lady is Jewish. And they're considering using DNA, because although it's not enough maybe to Paskin that, but maybe it could be added to the evidence, and possibly the DNA might be useful. So these things are being considered. But I'll give you one application. The chief rabbi of Rome today is a man called Rabbi Riccardo Dussegni. He is not only a rabbi, but a doctor, as some of the best rabbis are. And he is descended from an Italian family that goes back 2,000 years to the expulsion, the Roman expulsion. And he has found bodies, not bodies, but skeletons in 3 places in Rome where they suspect they're probably Jewish. There are Hebrew and Greek inscriptions, and Rabbi Dussegni wanted to take bones to analyze the DNA to see if they carry the Jewish gene. He asked the Rabbanim in Eretz Israel, and he was told that it's not good to move the bones around. In fact, in one place where there are 1,000 skeletons, they then noticed that they're all buried like this. All the non-Jews are buried like this. All the Yidden, and they're buried like that. One hand, but a minhag that no one sees to have known before. And on the basis of that and other evidence, they figured that these are Jewish bodies, even though they never took DNA. There's another place where it's not clear, and Rav Asher allowed them to take teeth. He didn't want them to move the bones. But as we speak, the teeth are being analyzed for their DNA to see if, in fact, they're Jewish bodies. In Bologna, in Italy, there is a community that was exiled in 1560. You know, the Jews have been expelled from almost everywhere. The Jewish community was exiled from Bologna. The rich families took their dead with them. The poor families left their bodies where they were, and a convent was built next to the Jewish cemetery. And for 500 years, non-Jews have been buried on top of Jews. You know, there are many cemeteries in Europe where people are buried. So the community now wants to restore the Beis Olam there, and they want to know where the non-Jewish bodies end and the Jewish bodies begin. They wanted to take DNA to tell. And then they noticed that every single non-Jewish body has a ring on the finger with a crucifix. So they know exactly where the non-Jews end and the Jewish bodies begin. But these are some of the issues that are being raised, and using DNA to for population genetics research. Again, it's not yet enough for a psak that the person is or is not Jewish, but it's being used in many of these contexts. Let me tell you a very sad story. You probably know that in the 1950s and 60s, the Yemenites were brought to Israel, and they were housed in 10 cities around the country. Inevitably, babies became ill. Many babies were admitted to Israeli hospitals, and many disappeared. You know the story? Many disappeared. When the parents came to visit their child, your baby died, we couldn't wait for you, your child's buried in such and such a place. The accusation is the hospitals sold or gave away the babies, often to Holocaust surviving families without children. And this has been an extremely bitter and festering sore in modern Israeli history. Commission after commission has been appointed by the Israeli government, and it's never been clarified. Last year, the Knesset passed a law mandating opening the graves of those babies to take DNA to see if they are who they're supposed to be. In many cases, the parent's not alive, but siblings are. And we can tell with precision if this child is a sibling of someone else. And you probably saw in the news about a month ago, they opened the first grave in Petach Tikva. And as we speak, the DNA is being analyzed to see if in fact the story is true or not. But if you speak to Yemenites today, they'll tell you, I spoke to a Yemenite man last month, he told me that his aunt gave birth, and 2 hours after the birth, the baby disappeared in the hospital. So when he was born 2 days later, his mother picked him up and went out of the hospital. She was too afraid, right, to let the baby out of her sight. So there are great hopes that this will be finally laid to rest. Not so simple because the graves are very small, the ground has moved, people in Eretz Yisrael are not buried in coffins except for soldiers. So, and some places more than one baby's been put in the same grave. So there's going to be some challenges, but there's great hope that the DNA will give us evidence that finally will bring closure to this very bitter episode. So those are some of the issues governing identification of bodies, legal, forensic medicine, and Jewish genes. These are some of the modern issues. Let me speak briefly about marriage and premarital screening. You know, I think it's very important. Again, I'm not here to tell you what to do. You have your rov, but it's been broadly encouraged that people before getting married are screened to see that they don't have incompatible recessive genes. You probably know there's a Doyu Shorim program that's used here, I presume. So there are two ways to do this. One is Doyu Shorim, which is an anonymous system, right? You simply have your blood taken to young people, and then it's sent to the lab in New York. Rabbi Eckstein and his wife, who started this program, they themselves lost 4 or 5 babies to Tay-Sachs disease. And to prevent this happening to other people, they set up this premarital screening program. The reason we need it is that in the Ashkenazi community, we have a high level of certain genetic recessive diseases. Why is this? The theory is that because in the 1600s, there were less than 2 million Jews in Europe, probably, which is genetically known as a bottleneck, a very small population. If there are 1 or 2 people who have a genetic abnormality, almost inevitably they'll marry cousins. And then you'll get an expansion that's called a founder effect, where a lot of people downstream will have the same gene. That's probably the reason. Sfaradim have their own panel of genetic issues, but among Ashkenazim, we have Tay-Sachs and familial dysautonomia and cystic fibrosis and a number of diseases that are very serious, that either kill children when they're very small, with a lot of anguish and pain. And these are things we very much like to prevent if we can. Tay-Sachs carrier rate is more than 1 in 30. That means 1 or 2 people sitting here tonight probably have the gene. In my class at medical school, there were 120 Jews, and 2 of us turned out to have the gene in a research study that was done, which means your chance of marrying another Ashkenazi who has the same problem is 1 in 900, and 1 in 4, more or less 1 in 3,000 babies is going to be born statistically with this awful and lethal disease. And therefore, the project is to screen people before they marry. Of course, you can always avoid the problem by marrying a Sephardi. Very healthy option. But if you don't do that, then you should consider premarital screening. This works extremely well in an Orthodox environment where people meet by design. Of course, if you live in the secular world where you meet your marriage partner late on Saturday night in a psychedelic haze, in an institution of dubious, standards, then of course it might not work so well. But in the Orthodox world where people agree to meet, you can screen yourself before you meet your partner. There's no emotions or relationship. Yet, and that is very highly recommended. The reason it's done anonymously is there was a concern years ago that if people are known to be a carrier of a recessive gene, people might stigmatize them and not want to marry them because there's something wrong with you. And there's nothing wrong with you, you're a carrier. You just need to be careful that you don't marry another carrier. Today, there's been a large move in some parts of the Orthodox world, of the Torah world, to screen people openly. Rather than do this secretive stuff, just go, what do you use here, JScreen or Genetics or?
I don't really use it here.
Do you have your own program in Toronto? Go show him. Okay. So in some places in South Africa, for example, there are 2 open testing programs. In New York, there's at least 1 or 2. Some people choose to do Doshon, which is great, and I've worked with them in many cases, and I no doubt thousands of disasters have been prevented. But some people now are moving to open testing. You simply pay your money. 10 days later, you get a report on what you have. 10 or 20 or 30 genes. And of course, once you've got your report, if you want to marry somebody, you just check they don't have the same recessive gene. There is another way to do it. There's a professor in London that I've worked with. He likes a panel of 400. He's not dealing with Jews, so he brought that. Of course, it does cover the Jewish options, and that is something you can do. I feel it's not a good idea to do whole genome sequencing, because almost always you find something. Now you get a report, 15 variants of unknown significance, okay? And then everyone starts panicking. What does it mean? That just is asking for trouble, in my opinion. But these are some of the options that can be done. And so you can prevent marriages where you have a incompatible recessive gene, and of course, avert tragedies and serious suffering downstream. And I highly recommend, I don't know what the Rov's opinion is, I personally think it's a very good idea for young people.
Everyone knows it.
Oh, okay, great. Now, let's move to the next issue. What happens if you have a couple who already have a genetic problem? They've had a baby, that has a problem. They don't want another child. Here we move to an amazing new technique, and maybe I'll finish by speaking about this, which is called PGD. You have a program in here? So PGD or PIGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, is an amazing, amazing breakthrough. And what this means is that we can now take a couple who have a genetic disease that they have in common, and we can almost guarantee them a baby who doesn't have the problem. How is it done? So the old method of excluding genetic diseases, as you probably know, you have a woman who's pregnant. Now you start investigating what the situation of the pregnancy is. Often to get a genetic diagnosis, you need to do an invasive, put a needle into the uterus or take a snip of placenta. These are not innocuous tests. About 0.5% of pregnancies are lost that way. Some kids are born without fingers and toes because bands are set up in the uterus. There can be complications. And moreover, when you discover an abnormality, then the discussion of a termination of a pregnancy, which is very problematic halachically, and it's traumatic, and that is not ideal. Even more cruel, going back some years, there were women who were terminating their pregnancies just because they were boys. Some diseases are carried by the girls and suffered by the boys, like hemophilia. There were women who were terminating their pregnancies just because they were told they were having a boy, just on the 50% chance that the child would be affected. Serious problem in halacha, and major trauma and guilt, and that's what was done. Nowadays, we have moved beyond that. First of all, just as an aside, you know that now we can diagnose a baby's genes from a blood test on the mother. Are they doing that routinely here? And you know that we've recently discovered that enough DNA shed from the baby into the mother's circulation, we don't need to put a needle into the uterus. We can take a blood test from the mother and tell her she's having a blue-eyed girl or a brown-eyed boy. You're familiar with this? Amazing. We're also doing cancer screening that way now. You know that? If somebody's having a cancer and we want to know whether it's growing in the body, you can take a blood test. We know that cancer shed enough cancer cells that circulate in the circulation, we can actually pick them up from a blood test. That's a whole amazing new world. It's not quite routine yet, but it is being done. So we are now able to diagnose problems that way. But a much better option is you can now prevent the pregnancy in the first place. And the way it's done, Sharet Tzedek has a wonderful program under Hashgacha. Hadassah has a program. Many cities around the world. Sharet Tzedek has a particularly good program. It's run by Professor Altarescu. She's a wonderful Romanian lady professor. I've sent many people there. I've actually been there to see the unit and see how they do it. And what you do is, let's say you have a couple that had a child that has a disease. They don't want another child with the same problem. You use permanent contraception. And when you're ready to have a child, you use IVF. So you collect eggs from the woman. The husband fertilizes the eggs, done under Hashgacha, to make sure that nothing untoward happens or other specimens are mixed in. And then what they do is they take the embryo at a 4-cell stage or an 8-cell stage. Again, you're dealing with what's called a blastocyst. You're talking about a very early stage embryo, only 4 cells. You take off one of those cells, check it under the microscope. If it's abnormal, you discard the embryo. There's no issue, no problem with it. The Catholics have a problem with it. But there's no halacha that says, you're talking about 4 cells or 8 cells. By the way, what's quite amazing, which is an unexplored area of medicine, is if you take 4 cells, you know what happens when you get fertilization? You have 1 fertilized cell. Within a couple of hours, it divides into 2 identical cells, 4 identical cells, 8 identical cells. If you take these 4 identical cells, you take off one of them, the remaining 3 don't become 3/4 of a baby. They become a full baby. And no one knows how that works. Again, let me just be clear about this. Human reproduction works in such a way that you get 1 fertilized egg, becomes 2 identical cells, 4, 8, 16, 32 identical cells. They all have the same DNA. Each of those cells has the same instructions. And suddenly some start becoming head and some start becoming feet. How? And eventually your toenails do toenails and your eyelashes do eyelashes. And Baruch Hashem, your toenails never do eyelashes and your eyelashes don't do toenails. And nobody knows how that works. There's even a theory about this. You hear the mystery of this? You know, this is amazing. Even if you're Canadian, you can admit that it's amazing, right? No one knows. All these cells have the same genetic instructions. It's not that the toes get toe genes and the eyes get eye genes. Every cell in your body gets all. In Kabbalah is written that every mitzvah in the Torah has 612 others that are glowing dimly, but only one is alive. And every cell in your body is manufacturing whatever it's doing, and all the others are there sleeping. Nobody knows how that works. Anyway, be that as it may. So that's what they do. They take the early embryo and they check a cell. If it's normal, they implant the embryo in a uterus and she carries a guaranteed normal children. Sharet Tzedek last year delivered their 1,000th baby to families with serious genetic problems, not one child yet born with a genetic abnormality, right? This is an amazing opportunity. When Yashi was asked about this in the early days, of course, it wasn't a reality yet. Yeah, at that stage, Silberstein is recommending this in many circumstances. I've discussed many cases with him, and that is what he's done. So let me tell you a story. A few years ago, a young lady comes into my office. She says, Rabbi, I have a very serious dominant genetic disease. Now, dominant means, recessive means 2 people with the same gene need to marry to have the problem. Dominant means whoever you marry, you've got a dominant gene. That means what they call big D, little d. So this lady's got a big D disease gene and a little d normal gene, but it's a dominant disease. That means she has the disease. And 50% of her children will have the disease. She says to me, look, I have this disease very mildly, Baruch Hashem, but in my family, it's been disastrous. My father's had multiple transplants and all sorts of disasters in the family. 50% of my children are going to have this. Who's going to marry me? I said, I don't know. 2 weeks later, a young man walks in and he says, Rabbi, I have my eye on that young lady. Could you introduce us? Now, fortunately for me, he was aware there's some problem in the family because the father's ill. I said to this young man a few years ago, I don't know what I would have said to you, but now you have an option. If you choose, you can meet this young lady and date, and if you decide to marry her, you will use IVF when you want to have a child, and they married, they've just had their 3rd normal baby, right? So this is amazing stuff. I had another family came to see me. They have a 4-year-old child who's fine, and an 18-month-old baby with profound congenital deafness that is inherited from his parents. We don't want another baby like that. Send it to Sharet Tzedek. It costs about 50,000 shekel. How much is that? 15,000 Canadian dollars. It's nothing compared to American prices. And if you're Israeli, it's free. Probably the only country in the world that pays for fertility treatment because it's such an important part of our culture. By the way, listen to this. There are 2 non-Jewish groups in the United States today suing in the courts for the right to use PGD to produce abnormal babies. You hear this? They want the right to use PGD to select abnormal babies. 2 groups. Deaf people, we want babies like us. What's wrong with us? We feel we're superior to other people. We want deaf children. We want to use PGD to produce, and the courts are grappling with the issue. Is that right? And the second are achondroplastic dwarfs. They call them the little people. You see these people in circuses and they've got very, very short arms and legs. We want children like us. We want to use PGD to guarantee people like us. 3 reasons. Number 1, we cool, nothing wrong with us. 2, would you like to be 3'6" and have the discipline as 5'10" teenager? And thirdly, our homes are designed for little people. We've got bathrooms and door handles that are very inconvenient. And the courts are grappling with the issue. Is this the right thing to allow? Okay, in halacha, I leave you to think about that. But these are some of the issues that are being discussed. Sharet Tzedek at the moment, it's a scarce resource. They are trying to use it only for life-threatening diseases. There's a woman who went there some years ago. She told them in the hospital, I have a genetic condition. I lost all my hair as a child. Very embarrassing. The children used to pull my wig off at school. I had trouble getting married. I want PGD so I don't have a daughter with the same problem. They said, lady, we're not doing it. It's not a life-threatening problem. She went to Rav Neuwirth at the time. He called the hospital. He said, this is important. You do the test. So they did it. So each case is decided on a assessed whether they deserve the test or not. What's done with the embryos that are not used? Oh, by the way, in some countries, it's big business to use PGD because we want a boy or we want a girl. Israelis have taken the view, you're not allowed to use PGD unless you already have 4 or more of the same gender. Then you can use PGD, otherwise they won't pay for it. But I'll tell you where it is used for sex selection all the time. Let's say a woman comes for PGD, she comes to the hospital, say Sharet Tzedek Hospital, and let's say you fertilize only 1 egg, you stimulate the ovaries and you try to get as many as you can. Let's say you collect 8 healthy eggs. Now, 3 of them are diseased, you discard them. You got 5 left, 3 male, 2 female. You say to the parents, which one do you want? You're only going to use 1. It's illegal to implant more than 2, but they're only using 1. So parents are choosing which gender they want because you have to make a choice. What do they do with the eggs, the embryos not used? They either freeze them for future use or sometimes donate them to other couples. And then you have another whole problem in halacha, because here you have Mr. and Mrs. A who produced an embryo. Mrs. B now gives birth to the child. So who's the mother? So Rabbi Poskim holds that the genetic mother is the real mother, but because Rabbi Eliyashi was very clear that we should conduct ourselves misafek, we are doing a doubtful gerus if one or the other mother is not Jewish. In the London Beis Din, they do the gerus and they don't give a certificate of gerus. Now, Mechut is actually one of the dayanim on the Beis Din. They simply give a certificate of what we did. In 20 years' time, you can decide if this person's a ger or not. That's what they do. But I'll tell you what the interesting problem is. When the embryo is used by a non-Jew or a Jewish woman gives a surrogate situation, an egg to a, pays a non-Jewish woman to carry the pregnancy, if it's a boy, as the Rav will tell you, what happens is 8 days later there's a bris, and now the moil has a problem. Is this a bris l'shem bris, or is it a bris l'shem gerus? And it affects which bracha he will make. And if he's going to make a bracha on gerus, and everybody standing around will realize this is not a normal situation, it's embarrassing for the parents. So some of the moilim in London have decided to mumble. But the Dayanim in London have now suggested that, I don't know what you do here, they make the regular bracha on bris milah, which covers also gerus as well. But anyway, these are some of the interesting questions that are being done. And there are all sorts of versions of this. There's a Jewish fertility surgeon in St. Louis, Missouri, who has 5 sets of identical, not Jews, but 5 sets of identical twin women, in which each case, one of the women can have children and one cannot. One of the twins has eggs in her ovaries, and one doesn't. So here's what he's done. He's taken a piece of ovary with eggs from the fertile twin and transplanted it into the ovary of our identical twin sister. And because they're identical, you don't need anti-rejection medication, and all 5 now have children. Now, who's the mother? First, they got the DNA of, they look like their mother and their aunt because they're identical. And here's a deeper question than surrogacy, because you can consider that the piece of ovary that's implanted into the sister, maybe it's bottled in the goof of fascinating question. But these are the kind of questions that are exercising the minds of our poskim today. I must tell you one more fascinating thing, and that is, and I'll take one of these plates here. Know that Sharet Tzedek has a program where they do this. You know that the woman's egg, the female egg, is a large cell. You can see it easily under the microscope. So let's say the woman has a genetic problem. We know it's the mother, not the father. Here's what happens. This is what my kids call way cool. You know that in every cell in your body, you have 2 copies of DNA, right? You know that. In the egg cell, of course, you only have 1, because during fertilization, the other strand will come from the father. Is this clear? So you get unzipping of the DNA code, and in every egg cell, there's only 1 strand of DNA. What happens to the strand that's not used? I don't want to hear from you, I know you know. What happens to the DNA strand that does not find its way into the egg? Any of our doctors know? It sits on top of the egg in a little structure called the polar body. And as far as we know, it's not used for any, it's not used. Listen to what they do in Sharet Tzedek. This is a woman with a dominant genetic disease. So she's got big D, little d. Disease gene, normal gene. They don't want to touch the egg. So they take the polar body, they pluck it off under the microscope, they check it. If it's abnormal, they use the egg. Because if the abnormal gene is in the polar body, you know the normal one's in the egg. That is cool. And if you find the polar body is normal, then you don't use the egg, because then you know that is where the disease gene is, right? So that's a fantastic program. Before you even fertilize the egg, you are diagnosing its status. And finally, every family that comes to the hospital is questioned. There's a Professor Steinberg is one of the members of the committee, and every Jewish family is questioned. Why do you need it? Is it a life-threatening disease? They're not doing it for recessive conditions yet. They're not doing it for BRCA genes. They're doing it for immediate life-threatening diseases for babies. Arab families are not questioned at all. The professor told me that when Arab families come for the testing, they ask no questions, because if an Arab woman cannot produce a healthy child, the husband will divorce or kill her. Disgrace to the family. So therefore, they don't ask any questions. They've had cases like that. They just do the test. But anyway, be that as it may. So these are some of the advances that we have experienced in recent years. And of course, the next step, which I won't talk about now, is the question of actually modifying the genome. Not preventing diseases, but actually taking a child or a person who has a genetic disease, using a CRISPR technology or other genetic editing technology, and you can actually modify the genome. Cut out the disease gene, implant the healthy gene. At least 2 diseases now being treated that way, and almost certainly we'll be moving into territory where we can actually treat diseases with genetics. There's no halachic objection to that, and these are some of the issues that we are experiencing. So thank you very much for this opportunity. If anyone has one question, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, thank you very much. My pleasure.